Okay, so let me dim the lights a bit. So we're really going to be changing paces from here on out in the course. We spent the first half of the course was material that is covered in BSC 1010. So if you do go on to 1010, basically this is where your class will stop. So you go into much more depth on all those chapters, but that's the chapters that you cover. You go up through genetics. A few chapters we didn't cover that you would cover in 1010 are things like DNA, protein synthesis, aspects like that. But it's very cellular, it's very interested in what's going on inside of a cell and how a cell relates to other cells nearby it. From this point on, we're going to be looking at organisms. So we've jumped right from cell to now looking at entire organisms and actually looking at groups of organisms. So we're not even going to be just focused on one individual. We're going to be looking at how individuals interact and how something called a population, the dynamics within a population, between populations. So we're going to start off today talking a bit about evolution, talking about change over time, what happens to populations over time, and we're going to spend 2 lectures on that. And really, the next chapter, chapter 14 as well, is also on the same topic. It's on a topic called speciation, where we're going to look at how new species arrive and how biological diversity arise. Then when we get into chapter 15, 16, and even really 17, which is after the next test, those are all on classification. We're going to be learning about really the biodiversity of organisms on Earth. We're going to talk about things like fungi and algae. We're going to talk about plants and lots of different types of plants. And then we're going to talk about animals. And we're going to be learning a little bit about all these different kinds of organisms and just some key features that these groups have and why we classify them and how we do, why we put them into categories. And then the course ends when we get to chapters 18, 19, and 20, talking about a topic called ecology. And ecology is a study of how different organisms interact with each other. So we'll start off today learning about one particular species, how a species comes to be, and then what makes different species different. And then we'll end up by learning how these different types of organisms interact and what kinds of interactions they are. So these are huge topics. These are really, really big scale things. So each chapter I'm going to be picking out just a few key ideas, and especially when we get into taxonomy, right, I could teach an entire course on animal diversity, but we're only doing maybe 2 classes on it. So I'm going to be picking and choosing specific groups of animals and telling you some of their features just to give you an idea of the diversity. So my plan to help you out in getting through these next chapters, because they are such large-scale chapters, and they're not I can't just say, oh, learn the light reactions, learn how the Calvin cycle works, or something like that. I'm going to, hopefully by the end of this week, for at least the first few chapters, make up a little outline that has the key topics from each chapter on it, and I'll post that on Canvas so that you have an idea of, well, by the end of chapter 13, these are the topics I should really know about, and you can it'll help you with focusing the reading and focusing the studying on those. So I'll be highlighting them in class, but again, I'll just kind of explicitly put them out in kind of an outline form, and I'll put that on Canvas. Just because they can be overwhelming, and there's so many different directions you could go in these next few chapters because we're getting to such a large scale. Okay? And definitely, as we go through these, I would highly recommend bringing slides to class with you to help you get through these. Some of the slides for these next few chapters have a fair amount of text on them. So if you're trying to write down everything that I've written on the slide, you won't have time to pay attention to what I'm saying about it. So I might suggest at least either bringing the laptop with you, bringing the slides with you, somehow getting it so you don't have to write down everything that I put up here, at least in class. All right? And definitely stop me as we go through stuff if this not makes sense. And you'll notice that I've used a lot of images that are not directly out of your textbook. Some of these are from the full version of the Pearson textbook, honestly, because some of them I chose, they illustrate things a little bit better than are in your book. But spend a lot of time in the text reading through this. Okay, so we're going to start talking about a process which has shaped life on Earth. It's really, it accounts for how diverse biological organisms are. So how all the differences, by diversity I mean how different things can be. So how different a fish is from a coral and from a scuba diver. But it also accounts for similarities between things. So how things like cellular respiration and photosynthesis are common threads across very diverse organisms. So that's really what we're talking about in this chapter. And that is the process of evolution. So really, it's a concept that helps explain the differences as well as the similarities in organisms. So evolution is basically a term that means change over time. And we're going to be looking at the evolution of populations. And what a population is, just so we're going to go into more depth on that later on in this chapter, but just so you know what I'm talking about when I use the word population. Population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. So all of those things have to be true for something to be a population. They have to be the same species. So we won't talk about fish and seaweed as a population. So the fish in an area would be a population, but it would have to be a certain species of fish. So just the tarpon in an area could be a population. And they have to be organisms that are individuals of the same species that are living in the same area, and they are interbreeding. So they are sharing DNA. They're actually going through the process of mating. Over generations, populations will change, and that is evolution. So the way I'm going to explain this really throughout this chapter is not so much explaining exactly what evolution is or the exact details of how it happens, but I guess it's going to be more of the ideas of why it occurs and all the competing ideas for how evolution occurs over time. But evolution just means change over time. And we're going to be talking about very different people's ideas in history of how this change occurred and why this change occurred. And there's lots of different theories for how evolution occurs. But evolution is just the idea that change occurs over time in populations. So you've probably all heard of this guy's name, Charles Darwin. In the mid-1850s, he published a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which was groundbreaking at the time. And it wasn't groundbreaking because no one thought evolution occurred. Most scientists agreed at the time that evolution occurred, that species changed over time, that there was change over time. It was that he proposed a very elegant mechanism for it to have occurred. So he gave people tons of evidence for his mechanism, and he gave them a very clear and very beautiful mechanism by which things occur. So we're going to go into more depth on exactly what he said later on, but really there were two main points that he made that I want you to really know about his book and what came out of this. His first point were that species were not created in their present form, but they have evolved or they have changed from ancestral species. So species that are around today are not the species that they originally were. They've changed from previous species. And his second point was that natural selection, which is a process that we'll talk about what that means, is the mechanism that would drive forward this change, would drive forward the evolution of these So it was a truly radical book at the time, because it didn't only challenge prevailing scientific thought, it also really challenged a lot of people's ideas of themselves and of things that were really firmly held beliefs in Western culture at the time. So it was a pretty amazing book to come out at the time it did. It did come out at a very good time, I think, for this, because there were so many people working on similar questions that the scientific community was ready to accept his ideas that he put forth in this book at the time. Okay, so really, if he had published this book 100 years earlier, it probably would have never been read. But because at the time there were so many other scientists doing similar things and maybe coming up with different hypotheses for how it worked, his book was very readily accepted. So before we talk about Darwin's ideas and the ideas he put forth in his book, I want to give you a little bit of context for what was going on when he was writing these ideas down and what other scientists were saying at the time. So Darwin he lived from 1809 to 1882. So you can see from this chart his life span is in red there. On the top are other scientists at the time. So we're going to be talking about a bunch of them, including Linnaeus, Hutton, Lamarck, Culver, and Lyell. Those are all scientists whose work Darwin based his work on. And Wallace, who also had ideas that were very similar to Darwin's, was a contemporary of his. In terms of what kinds of things were going on at the time, Darwin's book came out in 1859, which is right about the time the U.S. Civil War was going on. So that's, if you think about it historically, that's when that was occurring. He was born not long after the French Revolution, and the bottom part here, if you want to review this later, has other kind of historic moments in science leading up to his paper, and we're going to be talking about a bunch of these things. So I'm going to go through some of these historical events as well as some of the people that were proposing ideas from which Darwin was able to draw his ideas for evolution on in the next few slides. So Aristotle, long time ago, so 322 BC. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, had an enormous influence on Western society and on science. His idea was that species are unchanging and independent, and that they were all created in the form that they are in currently, and he actually went so far as to arrange life by complexity in a ladder-like scale of nature. So he had this idea that the forms of life are fixed and they are perfect the way they are, and that you can actually rank things. And of course, humans were at the top of this ladder, and single-celled organisms were at the bottom of this ladder. And as they moved up the ladder, they were more complex. So obviously, humans were the most complex things that could ever exist on Earth, which you'll see is a big theme in biology, is that we're very human-centric. So his concepts directly agreed with the Old Testament, and they dominated Western thought. They were really things that most people believed around that time, and long after his time as well. So jump forward to the 1700s to a guy named Carolus Linnaeus, who actually changed his name to be more Latin-like. He also believed that species were fixed, that they were created in the form that they are today, and that they were fixed and perfect. But he thought that you could go about grouping them in a different way. So he didn't group them in a ladder-like progression. He grouped them in a way that they could be lumped together in groups based on similarities. And he had this hierarchical view of their similarities. And this is something that we're going to talk a lot about in a future chapter when we start looking at taxonomy, because the system that he came up with for naming species is still around today. We use the Linnaean system for naming species. So although a lot of his ideas about species and species interrelatedness that were not correct and are not accepted currently, his binomial system came up. And so you've probably heard of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That was his. And he used a binomial system to name each species. Each species has a genus and species name, which is what they're commonly referred to by. And like humans are Homo sapiens, that is our name in the Linnaean system. All right, what's kind of an interesting side fact about Linnaeus? Every species, so taxonomically, and we'll get into this in more detail in a future chapter, but taxonomically, every species has what's called a type specimen. So in my work, if I collect something that's never been described by anybody before, and I give it a name, I have to identify one particular individual plant and say, this is the type of this name. And so everything has to be compared to this individual. And this is one thing that is very useful taxonomically, because if there's any variations within what you called a species, the type is always tied to that name, and the other ones can be changed. So there's always a type for every single species. There's what's called the type collection. It's the one that the whole species is based on. And for humans, Linnaeus is the type. So he is the type specimen for humans. So we're all compared to him to identify us as humans, which is, I think, pretty cool. There is a type human. That's it. So, like I was saying, Linnaeus used a hierarchical classification system, and you've probably seen these words before. So every species is named by a binomial. So here, the American black bear is Ursus americanus, and Ursus is the genus, and Americanus is the species. There are other bears, like grizzly bears and polar bears, that are also Ursus, but only black bears are Ursus americanus. And then they have a higher level called a family. And family includes all the Ursus individuals, as well as some other closely related groups, like pandas and things like that. And that's Ursidae. Then the order is a little bit even more broader, and so Carnivora includes all other species that are in the same order as the bear, which includes some other carnivores, like wolves as well. And then the class is even broader. So Mammalia were in the class of Mammalia, so that's even broader. And then there's a phylum, Chordata, which includes things like frogs and fish are also in that group. And then Animalia includes even sponges and some even broader number of species. And then that's the kingdom level. And then at the domain level, it's Eukaryota, or Eukarya, and that includes all eukaryotes. So anything that's not bacteria or archaea is in the same domain as Ursus americanus. So he grouped things by similarities, and we still do this today. We still place things into categories based on their similarities. And we do things like this. In Linnaeus's mind, he never intended us to use his system the way we do today, where we actually attach evolutionary history to things, and we say that things that are in the genus Ursus are more closely related to each other in terms of their evolutionary history than they are to other things in Carnivora, for instance. He didn't intend it to be that way. He just used it as a way to classify things and be able to understand his world by saying these things all share similar traits. And so actually his species, the grouping that he put them in, are things that we have changed many times since his time. So he said these similarities were just due to God, the way God created them. It's not due to how they were related. But what's amazing, I think, is how closely this system matches up with the work of Darwin from his book, where he actually drew a tree, and here's a phylogenetic tree, and we're going to see more of these later on in the course, where he wrote, I think and he looked at how species were connected based on their relatedness, and he was able to label these nodes, these groups of organisms, by their classification system. And you can actually put these classifications, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, directly on trees that scientists like Darwin have created, and it fits pretty well. So that's why we still use Linnaeus' system today. Okay. So the point of Linnaeus, which was in the 1700s, most people thought that species were fixed, that they were created in the form that they're in today, and they don't change over time. But there were researchers that were finding evidence that disputed this, like this researcher, George Culver. Collier, probably going to pronounce all their names wrong. He was doing his work in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and he was a geologist for the most part. And he's known as the founder or the father of paleontology. And really, he was one of the first paleontologists. So fossils. You guys heard of fossils before? You know what that is. Fossil is a preserved organism that's been typically it's buried, or traces of organisms that have been buried over time, and they've survived for many, many, many years. And by digging, you can find these fossils. So he looked at fossils in rock strata, and he looked at these different fossils that he could find. And he was mainly looking at sedimentary rock. And what sedimentary rock is when, especially if you're in like an aquatic zone, like a lake or something, as material dies, it will fall to the bottom of the lake, and it will form a layer. And over time, that lake is going to fill up, fill up, fill up, and eventually it'll be completely full. And if you look at a lot of rocky areas like this, you can see those layers actually. And those layers represent all the different years and different material that's been accumulating over the years. And so things that are found near the top of these layers are younger. They've more recently been buried there. And things that are found further down are older, are previous things. So there'll be younger fossils near the top and older fossils near the bottom. So what Cuvier noticed is that he could find things near the surface of these sedimentary areas that looked fairly similar to things that existed, that were alive. He could make them out, and he could actually put a name on it and say, this looks like a mussel. This looks like a snail. This looks like something that I can put a name on. But the deeper he went, the more dissimilar things were found. And when he got really deep in these rocks, he was finding things that he'd never imagined could exist before, and definitely never heard of anybody finding things like that were living, and they looked very, very different from what he knew. So, does anyone know what this is? Like this before. This is something called a baldibite, and it's something that has not existed for, about 250 million years. So this is an organism that lived on Earth about 250 million years ago. So it's really not like anything we have today. And what Cuvier kind of concluded from all the work he was doing and all the different things that he saw was that extinction occurred. That was really what he came up with. He said things had to go extinct. They had to disappear. And that's why we don't see trilobites like this walking around on Earth today. And this was revolutionary. This was really a big concept at the time, because people thought everything that's here has always been here, and it's always been in the form that it's in right now. And that was the way people were thinking at the time. And he's the first one to say, well, there are some things that used to exist that don't exist anymore. And we definitely know this is true today. We've actually had things in recorded scientific history that have gone extinct. But yeah, he had evidence of these kind of crazily different things that we're not aware of. So his kind of contribution to Darwin's knowledge was the idea of extinctions. So kind of what's interesting, I mean, a lot of these scientists that contributed to Darwin's theories on evolution really didn't buy evolution at all themselves. He thought that the Earth was just too young for evolution to exist. He actually he literally interpreted the Bible to come up with what was it? I always forget the number that they put on things, but he thought the Earth was only a few thousand years old. So he thought there's no way that these things could change in that period of time. He actually thought these extinctions were due to catastrophism, which is events of complete global devastation, like the Noah's flood. Something that would destroy all life and basically wipe the slate clean, and that all organisms would be created anew after that catastrophe. That was how he explained extinctions. He said, okay, everything is buried because of these massive floods or massive tornadoes or whatever goes on, and then everything's created again anew, and that's why we don't see it anymore. So that was his proposal. So, there were other ideas. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, the late 1700s, there were two other scientists that were very influential for Darwin. These were James Hutton in 1795 and Charles Lyell. James Hutton came up with the idea of gradualism. And one of the examples of gradualism was a stream creating a valley or creating a canyon, and basically saying that existing landforms are shaped by existing processes. So wind, water erosion, earthquakes can explain the way the land looks today. So here's a picture of an image of the Grand Canyon from above, and at the base of the Grand Canyon is a river. And at first, this river would have been near the surface, and gradually over time, through erosion, that river has worn its way down, creating the steep walls of the Grand Canyon. And that is gradualism. So gradualism, unlike the catastrophism, takes a very, very long time. So it requires the Earth to have been around for a very, very long time for very, very small changes like erosion, like wind, to cause these changes, right? And really the reason we know that is through the work of Charles Lyell, who was right around the same time. He kind of modified this kind of just basic bare bones gradualism idea, saying that geological processes are relatively uniform, so they're not these huge events happening all at once. They're pretty uniform, and so their rates are pretty, and effects are similar over time. So again, it's going to take a long time for events to transpass to create some of the things that we see today. Okay, so we're later going to talk about Darwin's voyages, and he actually had Charles Lyell's book with him, and he was reading about this stuff on the voyage of the Beagle, which is, as we're going to see, one of the times where he came up with a lot of the ideas that he eventually put forward in On the Origin of Species. So again, just to kind of summarize what Cuvier, Hutton, and Lyell, what kind of influence they had on Darwin. Well, due to gradualism and the idea of slow change over time, it convinced scientists like Darwin that the Earth was far older than popular belief. So reading the Bible literally, some people have come up with a number 6,000 years, but in order for these geological processes to occur, the Earth had to be much, much, much older than that. and that slow and subtle processes persisting over long, long periods of time can actually cause huge changes. So you don't need these catastrophic events. You can have very slow changes just done over very, very long periods of time. So Darwin took these ideas that were originally formed based on geology, and he reasoned that similar subtle changes and subtle processes could, over long periods of time, have substantial biological changes. So if the same thing that happens to the Earth is happening to biological species, maybe that's how things change over time. So Darwin wasn't the first to apply these gradual change ideas to biological evolution, and he also wasn't the first to come up with a mechanism for evolution. He just did it really eloquently, and he had a ton of evidence for his paper, so that when he published his book, it was accepted, basically. So we're going to talk about some of the other people that put forth theories about evolution at the time, and then we're going to talk about Darwin's ideas, and you'll see how eloquent they are and how they make sense. So Darwin was born in 1809. He was the son of a physician, and he was, I guess, originally his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps and be a physician, but Darwin was not really interested in that. He actually ran away screaming from surgery, and it was not within his tastes. So eventually, like a lot of wealthy men at the time, he became clergy. He went to join the clergy, and his hobby was as a naturalist. So he was just very curious about things, and because he was in the clergy, because he was wealthy, he had a lot of free time, and so, like a lot of other very wealthy young men at the time, he just would tinker with things and explore his ideas. At the age of 22, he got the role of naturalist on a ship called the Beagle. So the HMS Beagle was a round-the-world survey mission boat. So its mission was to sail around the world and survey things, find out where things are, learn about uncharted regions of the world, and document everything that they came into contact with. So the voyage actually was to take a few years, and Darwin got to see lots and lots of the world. And it was during this voyage that, and through seeing lots of different parts of the world and encountering many different organisms from many parts of the world, that he started to form his ideas and observed many examples of what we call adaptations. So these are going to be organisms that have developed ways to survive in the area that they are in. So here's some of the things that we looked at. There's some really good books and things written about the Galapagos Islands and Darwin's time in the Galapagos. They were very influential to him, though he was influenced by many of the other locations he went to as well. In the Galapagos is a series of small islands that are pretty isolated from other things around them. And so a lot of the species that are on the Galapagos are what are called endemic species. They're only found in the Galapagos and nowhere else. So it's hard for things to get there. It's hard for things to leave there. He found on the Galapagos examples of adaptations. So an adaptation is a feature that makes them very well suited for a task that they are doing. So one of the things he wrote a lot about, and which there's been lots of scientific writing about, are the Galapagos finch species and their beaks. And they had different beaks that were adapted to the specific diets that were found on their island. So each island had specific plant species, had specific insect species, had differences between them that were different enough that birds with a slightly varied beak would do better on them. So island that has a lot of cactus is going to have a bird with a beak that is long enough, that is strong enough, so it's long enough to kind of bite between the spines, and is strong enough to be able to break through the flesh of the cactus. Whereas a bird on an island that has no cactus but has lots of insects might have a shorter beak that's going to be very quick to open and close and allow them to grab an insect very quickly. A bird that might be on an island that has lots of large, heavy seeds might have just a very thick beak that is going to allow it to have a lot of power to crush the large seeds. And so he noticed that on these different islands, there were birds that otherwise were fairly similar to each other. They're all finches. They all have a lot of similarities to each other, but their beaks were very well adapted to the type of food that was found on the island. He also observed that species species are often closely related to species from the same geographic region. So you would often find similar birds on nearby islands, whereas islands that were further away from each other, you would tend to find very distinct birds. So birds that were distinct. So for instance, if especially when you looked at globally, birds found in the Galapagos, even though they had all these variations in beak size, they were all pretty similar to each other, whereas birds found in maybe Australia would be completely different. So we found that regional differences were dramatic too. Okay. So and this all led to his ideas. So before we get into, again, Darwin's specific mechanism of evolution, I want to talk about competing idea that was around at the time. So Darwin was not the first to propose a mechanism of evolution. So scientists knew that species change over time, and they had that one, the catastrophic mechanism, which is that species are all wiped out and then God creates new species. That would be a mechanism of change of evolution over time, right? This scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he could actually took the fossils that were found through paleontology, and he would line them up and infer lines from old fossils to younger fossils to existing species. And he could actually find some cases where he could actually trace a line of descent from older fossils to living species. He believed that evolution would move from a more simple to a more complex organisms, and he could actually line them up saying that these species changed in this way to become the species that is around today. So again, the prevailing idea at the time was spontaneous generation. He was actually an early thinker to think that species could actually change over time. His mechanism that led to this change was something called use and disuse. He thought that body parts that were used to cope with the environment would become stronger, longer, better, more fit, whereas those that were not used would actually deteriorate over time. So this was the first part of the series, that things that you used were going to become stronger, and things that you didn't use were going to become weaker over time. And then his second part to his idea was that these acquired traits could be inherited. That an organism that improved a certain body part due to use would pass on that improvement to their offspring. So modifications an organism acquires during its lifetime are passed on to its offspring. So a classic example of Lamarck's idea is giraffe. So using his kind of model, there would be a horse-shaped organism that was living in an area where there was a lot of food up high. And so that horse would stretch up to reach that food, and over time their neck would become stronger and stronger and stronger. And so then when they had offspring, their offspring would be born with a stronger neck. And they would stretch and stretch and stretch, and their neck would become just a little bit longer and a little bit stronger. And they would pass that on to their offspring. And so over many, many, many generations, you go from a horse-sized neck to a giraffe-sized neck, just because every generation they stretched their neck a little bit. And that was how he explained these things, is that acquired characteristics in an organism are passed on to offspring. Probably something that you're right now thinking, no way that's true. Along these lines, if this was true, then if I was to cut off my left arm and then have a child, they would be born with only a right arm, right? That's the same kind of idea, right? So we know this is not true. But there were lots of things in his ideas that kind of made sense. This gradual change, the way he could line up different fossils and link them together. This all led into Darwin's ideas, along with Darwin's view of all these organisms he saw on his trip. Okay. So, in 1959, Darwin came out with The Origin, and it was immediately a bestseller. And within a few decades of publication, pretty much all scientists accepted that evolution and the descent of species from a common ancestor was real. And this is stuff that, it was talked about by other scientists like Lamarck, descent from other species, and evolution. So this was not new. So the idea of evolution, the idea of descent from modification was not the new part. What was new was his idea of how it happened. And this is natural selection. Natural selection is a process in which individuals with certain inherited traits will leave more offspring than individuals with other traits. And this is what the groundbreaking thing was in Darwin's theories. He also went forth to say that if species were somehow fragmented, because of this process of natural selection, over time, species that were separated and weren't able to interbreed would eventually change so that they would be distinct from one another. And this kind of led into his thought. And they would be recognized as new species. Okay, so the kind of really important thing about Darwin's work was that he could back it up with lots and lots of evidence at the time. So he wasn't like Lamarck, just kind of coming up with these wild ideas that really there was no way to back it up with really solid evidence. It was just his way of putting together things. It was just his hypothesis that he was proposing. Darwin actually had things that he could point to. So he could point to things like the fossil record. So they had been digging up fossils for a long time by the time Darwin came around. And they could find what he called transitional fossils. This is evidence of change over time. So there were, although living whales did not have bones like this, like hind limb-shaped bones, they could find fossilized whale-like organisms that had hind limbs, that suggested that there was a similarity between these organisms living in the water and living on land. They actually had these bones that were very similar to limbs. So whale bones now look fairly different than this, but historical bones actually look like a little foot. So there was fossil record evidence. This was an ancient whale called a basilosaurus. There's also evidence like comparative anatomy. So he could look at the appendages of living organisms like human, like cat, like whale, and like bat. So the forearm appendage of the human and the cat, and the flipper of the whale, and the wing of a bat. And he could see anatomical signs of descent with modification. So certain bones have been highlighted here in yellow and orange, and you can see that those same bones exist in the other organisms, but they're modified. They're very different size, they're different shape, but the same bones are found in the same location, just modified. So the forelimbs of mammals have some skeletal elements with modifications, and these are called homologous structures. So the word homologous means similar, but different, basically. It means that they have a similar historical past, but there are some current differences with them. Just like homologous chromosomes, there are similar genes, but different versions of them. These are similar bones, but different varieties of them. So homologous structures. So we saw fossil evidence, we saw comparative anatomical evidence. And this led Darwin to come up with several observations. So part of the reason why Darwin's work was so revolutionary is that he really argued his thesis pretty well. And he cited many, many examples from nature. And he was able to describe 4 observations, as I'm going to show you, and make 2 inferences. So basically what inferences are there hypotheses that are drawn out of his observations, and they're kind of things that he could come forward with and put forward, that really backed up his theory of natural selection. So his first observation is that within a population, so within a group of the same species that are interbreeding in the same location, there is often a great variety of traits. So here's just a picture of snails, and these are all snails of the same species, and you can see they have different colored shells, maybe different shapes to their shells that are slightly varied from each other. So they're all very similar, but they have slight variations within them, and we know this is true. When you look around the classroom, we're all humans, but there's a lot of variety. Right? We have variations between us, and we have different traits. So members of a population vary greatly in their traits. Okay, the second observation that he put forth was that traits are inherited from parents to offspring. And we know this by looking by the genetics that we talked about in previous chapters, that if you have blonde hair, you can pass that on to your offspring. If you have brown eyes, you can pass that on to your offspring. Doesn't mean you always will pass that on, but you do have the ability to pass on traits that you have to your offspring. Parents will pass on traits to their offspring. The third, so those are pretty straightforward. The third observation that he made by looking at many, many different species across the world is that all species are capable of producing more offspring than their environment can support. And we'll definitely talk about this idea more when we get to the chapters on ecology. But this is basically saying that you have the ability to produce more offspring than can actually physically survive in the environment. So maybe it's due to food resources, maybe it's due to just space limitations, maybe it's due to competition. There would be something that limits the ability of every single offspring to survive, but we can produce more than you survive. So you buy those first 3 observations. So variation in nature, variation can be inherited, and most organisms can produce more offspring than can be supported by their environment. Hopefully those all kind of make sense. All right, the fourth one is that due to lack of food or lack of other resources, many of the offspring do not survive. So this is fungal spore releasing spores. There's be millions of spores that it releases. They're not all going to survive. If they did, our planet would be completely covered in fungus all the time. But it's not, because there's competition. We have bleach. We can wipe them away, right? There are things that eat them. There's reasons why they might not all survive. So, based on those 4 observations, this is what Darwin came up with. This is kind of a summary of his idea of natural selection. So individuals vary, the variety is inheritable, individuals can produce more offspring than can be supported, and a lot of those offspring are going to not survive. So individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment will tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. So if you survive, you can reproduce. And if you reproduce, your offspring will look like you. Right? That's basically what he said. He said, organisms that don't survive are not going to leave offspring. That's kind of the other side of this. So this leads to inference 2, which is that the unequal availability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to an accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. So if only the individuals with favorable traits survive, then more of the individuals that exist on Earth that are alive are going to have favorable characteristics. Right? So because the individuals that had unfavorable characteristics died off before they could reproduce, those traits, those undesirable traits, disappear. This makes sense. Have I lost you guys? I know you're very quiet, but are you following what I'm saying about this? So it's pretty basic. Basically saying you survive, you reproduce, and your offspring look like you. And they probably have good traits because you survive. And they'll probably survive too. So this is the process of natural selection. So natural selection is a process in which individuals with certain heritable traits, so inherited traits, will survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. And as this happens over many, many generations, species that might not have desirable characteristics over many generations are going to develop an abundance of desirable characteristics. So if we look back at those birds that were eating the cactus, if only the birds so say maybe within a species of birds, some had longer beaks and some had shorter beaks. If only the ones with longer beaks were able to feed, they would survive and they would reproduce, and their offspring would have longer beaks. And if the birds with shorter beaks couldn't get the food and they died before they reproduced, there would be less shorter beaks in the next generation. So each generation is going to have more and more birds with longer beaks until those birds just all have long beaks. Whereas instead, there was it was more advantageous to have a short beak so you could eat insects, then only the short-beaked birds would survive and reproduce, and the longer-beaked birds would die off on that other island. So now you have one island that has all short-beaked birds, and you have another island that has all long-beaked birds, because the long-beaked birds lived on the island with cactus, and the short-beaked birds lived on the island with insects. So now you have two groups of birds that look very different. So kind of a key component to this is understanding that individuals do not evolve. Individuals either survive and reproduce, or they die and don't reproduce. Right? That's really the only two choices an individual has. They can survive or they can die. And they can reproduce or they don't reproduce. What evolves, what changes over time, is the population. So that bird population ended up having long beaks over time. It wasn't that one individual grew a longer beak, like Lamarck thought. It was that the birds that already had long beaks survived, and the ones that didn't have long beaks died. And so populations evolve, individuals evolve. So this is really important. This right here is a very important concept. Understanding what natural selection means and how it works is really the key thing to this chapter. So again, none of this would have been possible without all those influential researchers at the time kind of paving the way for Darwin to come up with this idea of the mechanism of evolution. And remember, evolution was not the thing that was being debated at the time. It was how does it occur? What drives populations to change over time? And his idea just was really, really nicely put. He also, in The Origin, he spent a lot of time, because most people reading this book did not have the extensive knowledge of variety of species on Earth as he did. He spent a lot of time talking about artificial selection. So this is natural selection, which means that natural processes in the world are going to favor individuals with certain characteristics. But he did actually start the book talking a lot about artificial selection, which is something that we've seen a lot. Humans do this all the time. So farmers do this. People that are breeding animals do this. You look at dogs. So dog breeds have been forced to go in different directions. So you've got a Great Dane, that what happened was two large dogs were bred together. And then from their offspring, they picked the largest of the dogs and bred them with another large dog. And they kept breeding together large dogs until they had a gigantic horse-like dog, Great Dane. For the Chihuahua, they did the opposite. So a breeder took the smallest of the dogs and bred them together. And so they artificially chose individuals to breed. His theory is very similar to that. It's just saying that instead of a human going out and choosing which things would breed, it's nature that chooses. So it's the individuals that survive their environment that are able to reproduce. And so nature's going to favor traits that make the individual a better survivor. Okay. So here's an example. Okay, so this is an experiment done in California by a guy named John Edler. He studied wild guppies. So guppies are fish. He studied these guppies that were in Trinidad, so it's a South American island, which live in these very small, fairly isolated pools. So each group of guppies is a population that's isolated from the other guppies. And he found that there were drastic differences depending on which pool he looked at how the guppies looked. So these are both guppies. They're able, if he puts them together, they can breed. They can have viable offspring. But the one on the left is kind of drab, not very pretty. The one on the right is very colorful, very flamboyant. They're both male guppies. So what he found was that, you probably can't read this. I guess you might be able to. So the drab guppies were found in, I guess this is the bottom pool here. So this bottom pool, he found that the drab guppies versus the colorful guppies were found in different pools that seemed to be related to the predators that were found in that pool as well. So guppies will mature over time, and they actually don't get the coloration until they're an adult. So as a juvenile, they're all drab, and then as the males mature, they turn into this flamboyantly very colorful version. In pools that had pike cichlid predators, so another kind of fish that eats fish, that preys on adult guppies, the adult males were very drab in color. So they all looked like the ones on the left up there. But in pools like the upper left there, where they had killfish and no pike cichlids, the killfish would mainly feed on juvenile guppies, which themselves were not very colorful. The adult males were brighter, the brighter version, or the version on the right. So what he did is he found a pool, the upper right one, where there were no guppies naturally living there, but it had killfish in it. So it didn't have the pike cichlids, it had the killfish individuals. And he took some of the guppies from this pike cichlid pool, and he moved them into that pool, just to see what would happen over time. So he took transplanted guppies into a pool that had killfish. Remember, those are the ones that eat the juvenile guppies, but had no guppies at all. And this is what he found. Over a fairly short amount of time, so here is results of coloration. He basically counted the number of colored spots on the fish. The orange is the source population, so it's the pool with pike cichlid predators. And the green is the transplanted population. So the area of colored spots and the number of colored spots both significantly increased. So these guppies went from being drab in color to being more flamboyantly colored. So what does this tell you about the guppies? So which ones are being eaten by the pike cichlids? Yeah, so the flamboyant ones are being eaten by the pike cichlids, so that in that bottom pool, that's why they're all drab. Right? It's not that those genes didn't exist in the population. There would be coloration in them if they weren't selected against. So the reason why he only found drab ones in the bottom pool, and he found many more bright colored ones in the upper pool, was because of that predator, because of that force. So this is a selective pressure. So over time, do you think those guppies in the bottom pool, where all the colored ones are eaten, you think maybe they might lose that ability to pass on the colored genes? Those colored genes might be lost eventually. So they seem to still have those colored genes. Somehow there's enough mixing. And probably one of the reasons is that guppies will occasionally wash downstream. And so some of the colorful guppies might come from the upper stream and actually be able to mate with them. There's still some mixture between them. But over time, those colorful genes might disappear from that population because they're always eaten. As soon as there's a colorful guppy, it gets eaten. So this is what Darwin saw. This is what he thought was the driving force of evolution. Okay. So this is just an example from your book that I want to just kind of quiz you on. Hopefully you're also awake and your attention. So this is something that people say, and I've definitely heard things like this before. Pesticides cause pesticide resistance in insects. What's wrong with that statement? Okay, yeah. So there is the thing. So this is how this. So you're using Darwin's idea of natural selection, whereas this statement is looking at it from Lamarck's perspective. So if pesticides could cause pesticide resistance in an individual, and then that individual could pass on that resistance to offspring, this would be true. But pesticide either kills the insect or it doesn't kill the insect, right? So that's what's wrong with this statement. Is that pesticides don't actually cause pesticide resistance. What do pesticides do? How does a population of insects become resistant to pesticides? All right, how? So how could evolution and natural selection lead to a population adapting? Okay, then what happens? Okay, so can anyone else help out with this? So
the ones that don't
die. The ones that don't die, yeah.
They reproduce.
Okay.
And then they pass on the fact that they don't die.
Don't die. Okay, so something that was present in those insects caused them not to die when they had pesticides put on, which is exactly kind of what you were saying there. But that leads to them surviving to reproduce, and therefore their offspring are going to be resistant to that pesticide. So here's pictures from your book on this. So here's a population of insects. You have, most of them have similar genes to them, but one has a chromosome that has a gene that confers resistance to pesticides. So just through random mutation, and things we're going to talk about later on in this chapter and later on in the course, that one individual is naturally resistant to pesticides. Pesticide is sprayed on these insects. Most of them die, but the one or ones that had resistance to the pesticide survive. They reproduce, and now their offspring are resistant. And so now you went from having 1/5 of your population be resistant to 100% be resistant. Okay, so this is what happens in hospitals all the time. So hospitals have lots and lots of bacteria in them because we bring together all the sick people, right? And they all bring their bacteria there. And what do hospitals do when a patient comes in with a bacterial infection? All right. Yeah, they try to keep them from infecting other people, but they give them antibiotics. Okay. So they give them antibiotics to kill off the bacteria. And maybe they don't kill off all the bacteria. Because maybe some of that bacteria was resistant to the antibiotic that they gave them. And so that bacteria survives. The patient feels better because most of their bacteria are gone, but they might have one or two that survive. Those ones reproduce. And so over time, you've killed off all the bacteria that are susceptible to the antibiotics that the hospital has, and you're left with MRSA. Things that, no matter what you give it, it survives, right? Because it's been, all the susceptible bacteria of that species has been weeded out, and you've only left behind the super bugs, right? So this is what happens, and this is why I usually recommend that unless you're working in a hospital or you're working in an area that you're probably covered in something that's horribly bad for you kind of bacteria, to not use things like antibacterial soaps regularly. Because most times the bacteria that are in your hands, they'll either wash away with just water or they're not going to harm you. So my hand is covered in bacteria right now. It's not going to hurt, probably, unless I touch something in the lab or do some more things like that. So I'll wash my hands with soap and water, but I don't need to use something that kills off bacteria, because chances are some of that bacteria will be resistant to that antibiotic, and all I'm going to be doing is increasing the number of antibiotic-resistant bacteria on the hands, and they're going to grow and grow and grow, right? So there's often times when you definitely need to kill bacteria. If the patient's sick, you need to get them better, but you don't want to give a patient that's not sick antibacteria or antibiotics, because now you've basically already spent that cure, and nothing that's in them is going to die because of that cure anymore. So anything that survived is going to now be resistant. Right? So that's the idea of evolution by natural selection. Okay. So, okay. Let's see where we stand here. Okay. So how do you guys feel about this idea? So that was an introduction to evolution by natural selection. You feel you kind of understand that concept, that things that survive reproduce more, and then their offspring have those characteristics. And can you see how this might lead to populations diverging in their traits? If one thing is selected for in one group and another thing is selected for in another group? So what we're going to talk about on Thursday is basically, we're going to finish up this idea of evolution leading to speciation, and we're going to look at different kinds of selection and what that effect that has on populations. So we're going to take this concept and kind of apply it to things. So that's what we're going to do. And there's going to be a little bit of math kind of at the end of the class on Thursday. So if you do have a phone with a calculator or something with a calculator, you might want to bring that with you on Thursday, because we'll be doing a little bit of math. I'm not going to give you complex math problems on a test, but the math that we'll do on Thursday will help kind of explain some of the concepts of evolution. So looking forward to that. And that's kind of the rest of this chapter. So, okay, we'll stop here for now, and we'll do the second half of the chapter on Thursday.